I want to start by saying I am not someone who scares easily. I grew up in a loud house, I've lived alone, I've worked night shifts. But what happened last Thanksgiving broke something in me that hasn't fully healed. I still eat at the kitchen counter now. I can't sit at that table. It was just me and my mom that year. My brother Ryan had moved to Portland, and my dad's side of the family had a falling out with us a few years back. So it was quiet. Peaceful even. My mom lives in the same house I grew up in, a two-story colonial in suburban Ohio. Wide street, big yards, the kind of neighborhood where people put out decorative gourds in October and leave them out until Christmas. We spent the whole afternoon cooking. Mom made the turkey, I handled the sides. Mashed potatoes, green bean casserole. That canned cranberry sauce she refuses to give up even though I've offered to make it from scratch 100 times. By 6 o'clock, the table was set for 2. We lit some candles, put on some soft music, and sat down together. That was when I noticed the chair. At the head of the table, my dad's old seat, the chair was pulled out slightly. Not a lot, maybe 4 or 5 inches. I figured my mom had bumped it while setting the table. I pushed it back in and we sat down across from each other. We were maybe 10 minutes into dinner when the candle at the center of the table flickered violently, even though every window in the house was closed. I looked up. My mom was mid-sentence and didn't seem to notice. I looked back at the candle. It was still again. Then slowly over the next few minutes I became aware of a sound. It was faint. A low rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, coming from the direction of that empty chair. I told myself it was the house settling or air in the heating vents. I've lived in old houses. They make sounds. But then my mom stopped talking. She was staring at the empty chair at the head of the table. Her fork was halfway to her mouth and she had gone completely still. I said her name. She blinked, looked at me and smiled like nothing had happened. She said she'd just spaced out. We kept eating. I excused myself to use the bathroom. When I came back, my mom was sitting at the head of the table, in my dad's old chair. I stood in the doorway of the dining room for a moment, confused. She hadn't sat there once in the 4 years since he'd passed. I didn't say anything about it. I just sat back down. But she looked different sitting there. She was facing away from me slightly toward the window, and for just a second, the angle of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders. She didn't look like my mother. The candlelight made the shadows on her face move wrong. I said her name again. She turned to look at me and she was completely herself. She laughed and said she didn't even realize she'd moved. Said she must have sat down without thinking while I was gone. We finished dinner. We did the dishes. We watched a movie. But somewhere around 9 o'clock, I went to check my phone in the hallway and I passed the dining room. All the lights were off. We'd cleaned everything up. The table was bare, except for the chair at the head of the table. It was pulled out again, and there was a single handprint in the thin layer of dust on the seat cushion. An adult-sized handprint, fingers pointing forward like someone had just stood up from it. My mom was in the living room the whole time. I know that for certain. I took a picture of it. I still have it. I've never been able to explain it, and I've never once asked my mom if she remembers sitting in that chair. I don't think I want to know what she'd say. I installed motion-activated lights in that dining room the following week. They've never once triggered at night. They triggered twice last Thanksgiving when I was alone in the house visiting. I flew home before dessert. My name is Daniel, and I've lived in the same apartment for 3 years. It's a third-floor unit in a mid-rise building in suburban Atlanta. Across the street is a row of older single-family homes, the kind with big front windows that glow warm and orange at night. I've always found it comforting. Living in an apartment, you miss that neighborhood feeling, so I'd leave my curtains open in the evenings and just exist with that view. I spent Thanksgiving that year alone by choice. I'd broken up with someone 2 weeks before the holiday. I wasn't in a family mood, and I genuinely just wanted a quiet night. I ordered a full pre-made Thanksgiving meal from a local place, picked it up at noon, reheated at around 7 and ate on my couch in front of the television. The house directly across from my building had a large bay window on the first floor. That night it was lit up from inside. Warm light, people moving around, exactly the kind of scene I'd always found comforting. A family having dinner. Normal. Halfway through my meal, I glanced up and noticed a figure standing at that bay window. Just standing, not moving. Looking out, I assumed they were watching the street or the rain. It had started drizzling around sunset. I went back to my food. When I looked up again, maybe 5 minutes later, the figure was still there. Still completely motionless. I thought it was a little odd, but people stand and stare out windows. It's not unusual. An hour passed. I'd finished eating, cleaned up, settled into a movie. I looked out my window again, and the figure was still at the bay window across the street. They hadn't moved in over an hour. I got up and stood at my window watching. The figure was tall, dark clothes. The interior light was behind them, so I couldn't make out a face. They were facing directly toward my building, directly toward my window. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's a busy street. They probably weren't looking at me specifically. I closed my curtains and went back to the movie. Around 11, I got up to get some water. I don't know what made me do it, a reflex probably. But I parted the curtain 2 inches and looked across the street. The light inside the house was off now. The bay window was dark, but the figure was still there, standing in the dark window of a dark house, still facing my direction. I let the curtain fall closed. I stood in my kitchen with my heart going and told myself there was a rational explanation. A mannequin, a coat on a coat rack, trick of the light. I was alone on a holiday. My mind was doing what minds do. I went to bed. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up for no clear reason. My bedroom faces the interior of the building, not the street, so I shouldn't have been able to see anything. I lay in bed in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting to fall back asleep. Then I heard it. One knock, on my bedroom window, which faces an interior wall 3 floors off the ground. I did not move. I want to be clear that I am not exaggerating when I say I was completely unable to move. I lay there for several minutes before I could force myself to turn over and look at the window. Nothing. Darkness and the faint glow of the parking lot lights. In the morning, I went outside before work to clear my head. I looked up at my building, up at my 3rd floor bedroom window. There were 3 vertical scratches on the exterior glass, long, even, and deep. On the outside of a window 3 floors off the ground with nothing around it to climb. I still live in that apartment. The scratches are still there. I checked the house across the street that same morning. There was a family living there. Completely normal. No idea what I was talking about when I described the figure in the window. They said they'd had their curtains drawn all night. Nobody in that house had been standing at the bay window. I need to write this down because I'm starting to doubt my own memory, and I've been told that writing it down keeps that from happening. Our family always did Thanksgiving at my aunt and uncle's house. A big place on the edge of a lake in rural Wisconsin. There were usually about 12 of us. My parents, my 2 cousins, my grandparents, some aunts and uncles I only see twice a year. That particular Thanksgiving, there were 10 of us around the table. The house sits on about 2 acres, and beyond the back fence, there's nothing but trees and darkness for miles. Dinner went perfectly fine. Turkey, pie, the whole routine. By 9 o'clock, some people were heading to bed. My grandparents first, then my parents. The remaining 4 of us, me, my cousin Tyler, my Aunt Dee, and my Uncle Mark, stayed up near the fire in the living room talking and watching football. It was sometime after 11 when Tyler and I went to the kitchen for leftovers. The kitchen at the back of the house had a large sliding glass door that looked out onto the back porch and the yard beyond. The yard light was on. A big motion-activated floodlight mounted on the back of the house that triggered whenever anything entered the yard. I was at the counter making a plate when Tyler said quietly, "Hey, look." I turned around. The floodlight was on, illuminating the backyard all the way to the fence. Standing at the fence line right at the edge of the tree line was a person. They were just standing there facing the house, completely still. We went and got my Uncle Mark. He came into the kitchen, took one look at the window, and immediately his whole demeanor changed. He told us to stay put, and he stepped out onto the back porch, calling out toward the figure. Nothing, no response, no movement. He came back inside and locked the sliding door. We stood in the kitchen watching through the glass. After about 2 or 3 minutes, the figure turned and walked slowly back into the trees. Not quickly, not running. Just a slow, deliberate walk like they had all the time in the world. Mark said it was probably a neighbor or someone who'd had too much to drink. He said these things happen out here. He kept his voice very even and calm. I don't think any of us believed him. We went back to the living room. The fire had died down. The football game ended and the television was just running late-night programming. Nobody really felt like talking much anymore. That was when I noticed the back hallway. In this house, the back hallway runs from the kitchen all the way to the bedrooms. There's a window at the far end of the hall that looks out to the side of the property. As I glanced down the hallway, I saw that the window at the far end had something on the other side of it. A face. I know what I saw. It was pressed close to the glass, close enough that I could make out the outline of a face and 2 hands flat against the window. Then it was gone. I told my uncle. He didn't question me. He got up, checked that every door was locked, and called the police. While we waited, Tyler pointed out something I hadn't noticed until that moment. There were muddy footprints on the back porch, coming from the yard up the steps and stopping right at the sliding glass door. They weren't there when Mark had gone outside earlier, which meant that while we were sitting in the living room, somebody had walked up to the back of the house and stood at that door, looking in at us. The police came, swept the property, and found nothing. No one in the woods. No one in the yard. They said maybe it was trespassers or kids messing around. But here is the thing I've never told anyone until now. In the morning, before anyone else was awake, I went out to the back porch to look at the footprints in the daylight. The police had walked through them, so the pattern was disturbed. But at the edge of the porch, where the footprints ended at the sliding door, there was one print that was clean, one clear footprint in the mud. It was pointing outward, away from the door, meaning whoever stood there, their back was to the glass. They weren't looking in at us. They were standing between us and whatever was still out there in the dark. I don't know what that means. I've thought about it every Thanksgiving since. I've asked my uncle, and he went quiet the last time I brought it up. He told me there are things that live around that lake that the locals don't talk about. He didn't explain further. He said we'd been lucky. I believed him. I still do. These 3 stories all happened during what should have been the most ordinary nights of the year. A holiday, a table full of food, people you love or at least familiar walls, and yet something made itself known. Something that doesn't care about your traditions or your plans or your locked doors. The next time you're gathered around a table this Thanksgiving, take a look at the empty chairs. Not to check that they're empty, to make sure they stay that way. If these stories kept you awake tonight, you're not alone. Subscribe for new true horror every week. And leave a light on.